Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and welcome to episode 4 of Book Musings, where I take a look at 1984 by George Orwell. This is no doubt a book many of us have, either read or we've probably heard a lot about. There's not a whole lot of books that I've read, multiple times. There's just too many books to read the same one more than once. But there are maybe, and then probably I can only count them on maybe my two hands, how many I've read two or more times. But at least after reading this during the past week, this is added to that list. I guess The Republic I've read a lot. I can't think of, Catch-22 I've read a couple times. I can't off the top of my head really remember any other books that I've read, multiple times. I'm sure there are, but the point being, it's definitely something, at least for me, if I take the time to not only read it, but then read it, multiple times. And no doubt that's probably true for, again, many of you guys out there. At the very least, most of us have heard of 1984 or have heard of George Orwell or have heard of maybe his other classic, Animal Farm, which I remember reading in high school and it being one of the few books I actually enjoyed. Remember really liking. And I don't know what that says about me necessarily. But it's also these two and then Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. I don't know about you, but at least in my subconscious, these have always been kind of interlinked and always thought of together. And they've all held a pretty noble place in my mind, or however I should say that. I've thought of them highly over the years, although with my terrible memory, I can't, really remember much details about them other than thinking very favorably of them, in particular of 1984. So I'd read, all of these before, but it's been so long, I guess the point is that I couldn't really tell you too much about them other than, I remember liking them all, and in particular, really liking 1984. Liking it more in particular than Brave New World. And I also liked quite a bit Animal Farm. But, now having gone back and read this over the last week, it's amazing to me how much I forget. I don't know if all these memories just go down memory holes or what, but it was interesting to kind of compare, since it's been probably at least a couple decades. Again, I can't really remember specifically, but probably a couple of decades since I've had actually read it before. Compare my thoughts now reading it with kind of the hazy recollection I had of reading it before. But it always had this kind of generally favorable impression in the back of my mind, at least. What was the background for me? So in this video, I guess just to say what the heck I'm doing here. In this video, I'm going to take a look, obviously, at 1984 here. Give you a little background in terms of why I'm reading it now, or in this case, why I listened to it for the most part, actually entirely this time around, why I listened to it this time around, what it was, what was the impetus for me going back and reading through it or listening to it again. And I'll tell you then what happened in 1984. So spoiler alert, I will talk about some of the things that happened. So if you haven't read it and you don't want to know what takes place, you might not want to listen anymore, because I will go into this quite a bit, and including especially the latter half and particularly the ending. I'll offer some reflections on that. And so, I'll talk about what happens in the book, talk about some prevalent themes, surveillance, conditioning us, and so on, things that I've thought a lot about in my own life, in my own, the deep recesses of my own personal reflections. And so there's probably a reason why I'm going back to this and reading it again. It really does resonate with me. I'll offer then my reflections on it. And although it resonates with me, I'll mention a few ways in which I was kind of disappointed. So, I'll ultimately offer then my Book Musings grade. We'll see if it reaches the Book Musings Hall of Fame. And maybe it'll be the first entrant onto the top shelf of the Book Musings Hall of Fame. Of course, it has to get into the Hall of Fame first, so we'll see if it even gets there. But if I'm reading it twice, listening to it twice, then there's a good chance it's a pretty good book. There's a reason why I'm going back to it. So anyway, let's go ahead and get into why I am getting into this book. Actually, it's interesting. I don't know. I tried to think about it while I was preparing for this, and I don't know what it was that was the impetus for me actually latching on to 1984 in particular. So I've mentioned in my other videos how, I'm a runner and I really like a lot of times listening to audiobooks. I love, philosophy and books in general. And so, especially when you're out running or doing exercise, which can be pretty monotonous and boring otherwise, it just helps speed up the time. And so, I was looking for, in these older books, you can get a lot of these audiobooks for free. And so I don't remember what it was in particular, but there I am entering 1984. Maybe I've been conditioned to do so. I don't know. But I entered 1984 and found it. And so I put it on my MP3 player. And voila, that was a week ago. And, it was pretty gripping. I've been out a handful of times to run. And, I have already read it in, again, the past week. And I was so, I'll talk more about this as we go, but I got so into it that I actually, and this doesn't happen too often with the audiobooks or anything I'm listening to when I'm on my runs, but I actually fired it up then on my computer and had it on in the background while I was doing things at home, just because I was so interested in what was going on. So I mentioned how I had, so I don't know exactly what it was that led me back to 1984. Maybe just what's going on in our current situation. Maybe I just feel like it's happening. I don't know. But here we are, and I was back at 1984, back to reading or listening to 1984. I mentioned how I did read it a long time ago. I don't remember exactly when. I want to say it's been at least 20 years ago. This is, high school probably when I read it. I do have again, a generally favorable impression of it. The ending I had associated with it, I think I confused with Brave New World's ending, which I can't confirm because my memory is terrible and I need to go back and listen to this. So actually, these two are next. I'm in the process of listening to this. In my last run, I started this one, but I'll then also tackle this. But I have a feeling that the ending I associated in the back of my mind all these years with this book was actually what happened in Brave New World, but I can't confirm it because I can't remember. Anyway, I had a generally favorable impression of all these books, these three in particular, because they all talk about things, that as a philosopher, and especially a very skeptical philosopher, talk about things that I have thought a lot about myself. I question seemingly everything, and so they really resonate with me. But especially 1984, I always had a very favorable impression of. And when contrasted with, say, Brave New World, I always would tell people that much prefer 1984. But now going back and listening to this and actually remembering, or in some cases learning for the first time, it seems like what actually happened in these books. I don't necessarily know that. I got to go back and listen to this one again, or listen to this one for the first time after reading it before, to really, I think, judge fairly what's the better work here. I do have very fond impressions, for what it's worth, of Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, and I don't mean to dismiss this either. I have good recollections of it. I just remember liking this one better. But what are those recollections even matter when they seem so ill-founded or inaccurate? And which is interesting now that I kind of think of it on the fly, because it jibes with one of the themes in Orwell's work, and that's that how can we really trust anything we think we remember, because so much of it is doctored by the powers that be, at least in this dystopian picture of the future that Orwell paints, or maybe the current present that we live in. Anyway, so that was kind of my impressions coming into the book. Obviously I mentioned how we probably all heard of it. It has reached this sort of status as a classic. It's been known as a classic, at least going back to my youth, and probably far before that even. So it's been highly regarded for quite some time. And so I guess I'll go ahead then and reiterate real quick that there will be spoilers. So I'm going to talk about what happens, but we'll go ahead then and dive into what the book's actually about. So 1984, it chronicles the life of Winston Smith, the life and times and death of Winston Smith. He's the main character. And I was trying to kind of go back. It's actually been a few days since I finished it, and I've started in on this one. And so it's interesting how these kind of connect too. But for what it's worth, Animal Farm, Orwell wrote published in 1946. So he wrote this one previously, and then 84 was published in 1949. You can definitely see the parallels, and there's all kinds of similarities and so on. But basically, again, going back to 1984, it chronicles the life and times and death, ultimately, of Winston Smith, the main character. And again, going back and kind of thinking about it, in my mind, the book really consists of two parts. The first part is like Winston Smith, the ultimate questioner, where he questions everything that's happening and, questions the main narrative of Big Brother. So Big Brother is, the power that be, if you will, the government that's in charge, that's controlling everyone. And Winston, questions like the account that Big Brother offers of history, right? So it's painted a certain way, and he's actually employed to go in and doctor, right, when it suits the narrative of the party, right, of Big Brother. Winston's own job is to go in and like sort of forge or doctor dates that had been a certain date before and make them different dates, after the fact to match what the party or Big Brother is saying nowadays. So he's intimately aware of this, but somehow everybody else that's doing the same thing is able to sort of just not realize it. They double think is one of these terms, right? Where you can like believe in two things at the same time, right? Sort of not acknowledge fully the reality of the situation. But Winston himself, at least in the first half of the book, it's giving an account of how he's questioning all this and wants to rebel and so on. So you see that constantly with his, the account of what's going on. But then the second half of the book is basically him getting caught, and then all the terrible things that ultimately transpire, and ultimately he ends up then reneging on everything he stood for and caving to the pressures and the powers that be, and being conditioned himself. And I'll get more into sort of the ending later, but it's sort of an overarching picture, if you will, of what's going on. Of course, there's all sorts of fascinating, details, like this idea of telescreens, where the idea is in every house, in every room, there's basically like a TV that monitors, can see everything that's going on and picks up all the sounds. And so the idea is you're constantly being surveilled, right? They're surveilled, being watched and heard. Everything, there's no, this is talked about a lot, there's no sense of privacy. You don't own anything yourself. Everything you do and say is always publicly available, if you will. At least you don't know who's on the other end of these telescreens. So, you could be watched or listened to at any moment. And so one of the cool things then is Winston has this little, given his apartment, at least he thinks, right, it's kind of cool. He's got this little area that can't be viewed by the telescreen. Of course, come to find out, it was probably all set up this way, right? I mean, who knows, what was actually what ultimately, and that's really the upshot of what ends up transpiring, is because people he thought he could trust, were actually monitoring him and watching him the whole time. But anyway, he has this little alcove, this little area which he thinks is out of the purview of the telescreen, where he then starts secretly keeping a journal detailing his questionings of Big Brother and his rebellious concerns in nature. And he stows this away, and again, in this little area he thinks is out of the sight of Big Brother, which of course ultimately is not. He confides with this guy named O'Brien, who he thinks is on his side. For what reason, I constantly couldn't understand. But ultimately, of course, O'Brien ultimately is the on the Big Brother's side. And there's also, of course, a love affair. Winston meets this woman, Julia, and of course, all this is not allowed typically, so they have to have this. By the way, keeping the journal is punishable by death. The party, Big Brother, doesn't want any free thought. Right? Everything's completely controlled and conditioned. So any kind of free thought that would be permitted by way of a journal is not allowed. So too, natural sort of uh, love affairs not allowed. So Winston and Julia, she hands him a note, "I love you." Of course, this the first time she's ever communicated at all with him. This sets off a series of like secretive communications, and they go off and have a love affair in a secret area, which they think can't be observed. And Winston rents an apartment above, like at the shop in the commoners area that he thinks, is completely free of the viewing of Big Brother because there's no telescreens in there. Of course, there actually is, but he doesn't know that. And so they meet up there, and ultimately he's, caught because there is a telescreen behind a painting there. And the shopkeeper who he thought he could trust, no, he's a member of the Thought Police. The Thought Police is a famous sort of concept from 1984 you might have heard of, where you got to watch even what you think, and you got to be wary of even the ideas you entertain. And this is how deep the party doctrine, right, is aimed. And so all this transpires, but he's ultimately sort of caught, and so then the whole second half of the book is really just a lot of kind of philosophical back and forth between him and O'Brien. So I guess O'Brien is like the one running the show for the most part, and so it's a lot of gruesome sort of administration of torture to Winston until he finally comes around and sees the light and conquers himself, if you will. He wins, but really he loses because he ends up, loving Big Brother. That's how the book ends, and as he takes a bullet in the brain, I guess in the back of the head. So that's an overarching picture again of what's going down here. So I wanted to touch a little bit though on like some interesting themes, especially themes interesting in the sense that they're things that I have myself thought a lot about. So things like, for example, 24/7 surveillance. That's a constant theme throughout 1984. Again, the telescreens everywhere you go, right? You're being watched and heard. And so he talks about how then there's this sense in which you're never completely alone, except in the confines of your own head. And he talks about how well then they can never get you there, but ultimately they do, right? Because look what ends up happening. So there's this sort of constant sense of never being completely having that sense of privacy completely. And that's something that I've always appreciated personally. And before I read this book, it was probably about a month ago. I remember going down the street and just noticing every street light. On top of every street light, there's a camera, and just this is probably something we've all thought about at some point, right? But just how many cameras there are that exist nowadays, seemingly, like this one. No matter where you go, there's seemingly a camera everywhere. Even in your own house, probably, or if you think about it, there's probably cameras all over the place on your phone, on your TVs in some cases, right? I mean, they're everywhere. We're always being observed. So it's like this is what Orwell's projecting is going to be the case. But it's something that I personally thought about constantly, and to the point where I actually don't want, and it's affected my purchasing of televisions. I don't want these smart TVs or these TVs that it seems like to me you can't ever actually completely shut off, right? They're constantly seemingly recording, and I don't know the intricacies of how they supposedly work, but who's to say what they're actually really doing too, right? I mean, supposedly if you push this button and this button, it'll turn it off, but is it really turning it off? Especially if you entertain, what guys like Snowden rather have revealed about, the FBI and CIA and their surveillance programs and monitoring and tracking, downloading all of our communications, and not necessarily accessing and reading them, but literally storing them, recording them, hence establishing a permanent record of them. Again, these cameras are everywhere. Who's to say the degree to which they are or are not recording our everyday affairs? So again, that's something that I've thought a lot about. to the point where it actually does affect my decision making in terms of like buying televisions and so on. Um, I think another thing that with regard to this, that kind of saddens me is it bothers me that it doesn't seem to bother other people as much either. Like, I don't think most people are as perturbed by this idea that maybe all our televisions are constantly, recording the audio in our room. I mean, and you hear this adage, well, or this idea, if you're not doing something wrong, then what are you worried about? Well, it's that's not the right issue though. It's the idea is, shouldn't there be a place for some sense of privacy somewhere? Shouldn't we be able to be alone somewhere, especially in our own homes, seemingly? At least know the full extent to which we are being monitored. I think that's another issue I have, is that it's not completely transparent or clear, or obvious, at least to the consumer, with respect to some of our televisions, for example, to what extent it is recording us and for what purposes and so on. Or it might be buried in hundreds of pages of legal doctrine, right? That user agreements that nobody ever reads because they're ridiculous, right? You don't have time to read them. Anyway, so these are things that's kind of worry, has obviously been something I've thought about. And so, Winston's concern then for the telescreens in 1984, that resonated with me quite a bit. And so I would encourage you then to also stop and think sometime about, just how many cameras are recording everything, and how many, microphones there are that are picking up all the sounds and so on. And is there anywhere that we are completely alone? And again, it is interesting. This, one of the ideas throughout the novel is like, well, they can't get in our minds, right? At least we're completely alone here. Well, no, they can. Big Brother will even get to that. I don't know. I don't know if I'm convinced. So more on that. Stay tuned for the end here. I don't know if I'm convinced with the implication of Orwell's ending, that they can get to us in here. Along with this, real quick, I'll throw this out, along with this idea of like this constant surveillance. Again, this is probably about a month ago. I don't remember the exact date of when I had this idea, but it was one of the things I was thinking about when I was on a run. There's birds all around, especially in this one point where I'm running. It's like eerie, kind of how many are just swarming around there. And I've had this thought, like, well, what if one of these species of birds was actually like robotic, government spy, mechanisms, right? Where actually that particular species didn't really exist. There's just a very complicated robotic, a bird robot, if you will. And so, they just fly around. We think they're just like a bird, but really they're monitoring, what's going on everywhere. And so I think, I have these kinds of thoughts and things occur to me. And so that just seemed reminiscent of the kind of picture you get conjured up by, reading something like 1984. And I'd also point out that, well, it couldn't be like this because this is what happens. It's the way we tend to think. Well, no, they say this. Well, how do we really know? Can you just trust what the powers that be say about this stuff, or what Sony or whoever is the producer, Philips, of the television that you're watching? How do you really know what they're actually recording? Like, how do you actually know? And another related point is like how whatever we are aware of as the general public in terms of our technological capacities is probably just the tip of the proverbial iceberg, right? I mean, I'm sure it runs far deeper, that their capacity or the capability of the powers that be run far greater than what we think. So we're only aware of, we only have a glimpse of, probably, I would assume, of the true nature of our technological capacities. Anyway, I would point out again how Snowden is suggesting, what he's revealed. I read this last year, almost a year ago, about this time. And this is actually one of the books that I read that kind of got me interested in doing a series like this, because I thought it was so compelling, so interesting. But by the time I started the series, though, I forgot too many of the details. But he's one who gives us seemingly evidence that what Orwell's projecting will happen in the future is actually coming to fruition in the future, which is now the present. Right. So, definitely. By the way, very interesting read. Edward Snowden's Permanent Record. Highly recommend it. Very much related to some of what the themes are in 1984. Okay, so another theme that kind of resonated with me in particular, and this gets really deep. So, in the conspiratorial waters, that is. So, I am speculative. I'm skeptical. I question things by nature, and those who know me know that I can, I question everything. And one of the things I think that people question the most in terms of like conspiratorial thinking, other than maybe like flat Earth, would be like questioning history. Because I don't think many of us actually have sat down and thought about this. But how do we actually know that the accounts we have of history are valid? I mean, we grew up with them. We were told this is what's actually happened. Read this, and so on. And so, it became indoctrinated in us. But how do we actually know that what we were told is fact? And that is a theme that shines throughout 1984, and I love that facet, right? This idea of the manipulation and control of history, that there's nothing permanent, that you can change it. And in fact, again, that's what Winston's job entailed, was going back and tweaking dates that didn't no longer jive with what Big Brother was saying nowadays, right? You have to go back and control the past, manipulate the past so that it matched up with the present day account of the past, right? Which of course suited whatever Big Brother's interests were. And it strikes people as crazy to question all of history, but just think about it from a logical perspective. Of course, that's easy to say. We all want to think we're logical, right? But think about it from like a Machiavellian perspective, right? You want to control power, right? You are the prince. You are a leader, and you want to control power. Well, maybe controlling people's impressions of what happened before is key to maintaining the power you have. And that is an idea that, again, is floated throughout 1984. And one thing that was really cool to me was there was this, it's this lyric in Rage Against the Machine is a group that I really like and listen to a lot. And there's this lyric: who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past, right? Speaking to the import or significance of being, having that power, right? Whoever controls the past is going to be able to control sort of what people have in mind as being good and what progress would look like, right? It steers people's ideas and what they end up doing, right? And it's a great then lever or means of control. And so Rage Against the Machine had this lyric, and I never realized, at least have no recollection of realizing that actually was from originally 1984, George Orwell's 1984. So that's straight out of 1984, right? This idea that there's great power in being able to manipulate and control people's construal or idea of what happened in the past, right? Well, we had all these mistakes, and this is what happened in the past, so we better not do this because this is what then happened after this happened, right? Or at least that's what we're told, okay? And so then that's going to lead us to do all these certain things. Well, it's very easy to see how, if you want certain things to be done, well, then you can control and manipulate people's impressions of what transpired in the past to get them to then ultimately do whatever it is you want them to do now. And so, again, you get that theme throughout 1984, and that's something that really resonated with me personally, and it's something that I've thought a lot about. And, the Rage Against the Machine song that's from is Testify, of a popular song by them. And by the way, no doubt, when you start questioning all of history, what's left, right? So I admit, um, questioning the veracity of our typical account of history. There's a lot of repercussions that follow from that. Like, what if you can't, if you can't trust that, what's left, right? What's beyond questioning at that point? And that's a pretty scary place to be, right? Practically speaking. So, I concede that, but nevertheless, right? I mean, the truth might not be pretty. I would just, I guess, emphasize that. Another prevalent theme throughout, somewhat related, right, is the idea of conditioning, controlling the masses, right? The ideas and thinking of people in general. Again, something that I've thought a lot about. If you've watched any of my other videos, if you know me personally, you know how much I detest things like commercialism and advertising, in part because of how I view it as conditioning and as unduly, in a negative way, influencing people. We know that people are affected by this advertising. We know that it works. We know that it makes them buy things that they don't need, and yet we still allow it to happen. Why is that? In what sense is that worse than doing other things? Other evils. The degree to which, I guess, I don't know if I'm explaining this very well, but the degree to which we allow commercialism to just take over, and it seems to be okay in an everyday sense. That has always bothered me a great deal. And again, that is something that comes out quite a bit in 1984. The degree to which we're all, or at least not we, but the people, right, in Oceania, the country, or not really country, country. There's three main civilizations or countries, big, huge nations, if you will. Oceania is the one that Winston belongs to. So everyone there is conditioned to think a certain way, to think certain things, right? That they were at war with so and so, one of the other main, nations, Eurasia, and of course, one of the things he talks about is how, again, manipulation of the past and history, our account of history, how he remembers that we were at war with East Asia before, but yet, according to all the present day history or accounts that you can access, because they've all been doctored, that never actually happened. Instead, I forgot which one I said, we've always been at war with Eurasia instead, and never been at war with East Asia. So the degree to which, so this novel speaks to the degree to which we are conditioned on a mass scale and an everyday level to think certain things and to somehow not question them at all. And, again, that's something that I've thought about a lot. Even people that are very close to me, I feel like, are, conditioned by, mass media and so on. And so, again, that's something that certainly resonates with me. This idea that, again, we all think that we're immune from it too. That's the thing, right? Well, the advertising won't affect me, or that I can't be conditioned a certain way. But everyone thinks that, right? But yet it's still working, right? They're paying millions on advertising, so it's working on someone, probably all of us, even though we all think it doesn't. So again, that spoke to me quite a bit. This constant sense of being conditioned throughout and having our thoughts, ultimately steered in certain directions, to the point where we even kind of are somehow willing to deny our own memories, ultimately. Winston fights against that constantly for a while, right? No, he remembered. I remember that we weren't always at war with Eurasia. At some points we were at war with East Asia, despite all accounts of it. I'm not crazy. This is my memory. He talks about how, nonetheless, everyone else seems to just go right along with it. And in the end, he seemingly goes right along with it too. One of the related points as well to this idea of conditioning, of course, the big brother. So the second half of the book, you get a lot of, when after he's caught, he's talking to O'Brien. You get a lot of the justification on the part of Big Brother O'Brien. It's for the benefit of everyone. There's this idea that it'll lead to the perfect society, but is it? Because look what ends up happening. You have to think certain things and so on, certain ways and so on. Otherwise, you get tortured, as Winston does. But this idea of paternalism sort of emerges in 1984. I think, by the way, I'll probably wait to explore paternalism in depth until I maybe give a book musings episode on Animal Farm, because it plays out a lot more in Animal Farm. But you get this idea of paternalism, coming out in 1984 as well. So if you're not familiar, this idea of paternalism is this notion that it's okay to control the behavior of someone, to not allow them, right, to do what they actually want, or make them do certain things they don't want to do for their benefit. Ostensibly, it's for their benefit, right? So it's like you're acting as the parent, right? So I can't let you stay up all night. You have to go to bed at midnight because that's what's best for you, right? So it's interference in someone's behavior for that person's own benefit, right? Two main ingredients there. Well, if you listen to my lecture on John Stuart Mill, who talks about this, and I believe on liberty, he articulates his famous harm principle. He's not a fan of paternalism. You'll hear me say, expound on why that is. So this harm principle, this idea we only ought to intervene in the behavior of others. He makes exceptions, other than like kids, right? We only ought to intervene in the behavior of others if what they're going to do is harm someone else. If they're only going to, if their behavior is stupid and it's going to harm themselves, look, who are we to constantly interfere in the behavior of other people, right? Let them do what they're going to do, even if it's going to harm themselves, provided it doesn't hurt other people, right? So he outlines his perspective in part because he's worried about paternalism, right? This notion that we can interfere in people's behavior because we think we know what's best for them, and if we let them do what they want, they would screw up. Okay, Mill wants to say, hold on. How would you like it if that was applied to you? Because once again, we always think we're the smart ones, right? Just like we don't think we're affected by advertising. When it comes to paternalism, we always think we ought to be the parent, right? We're the smart ones. Let me tell you what you shouldn't do. We don't, we get upset when it's applied to us, right? And that's what Mill points out. Okay, provided we're not dealing with children, he makes some exceptions, right? We ought to let people do what they're going to do, provided they don't hurt others. And that's always kind of resonated with me. I don't, practically speaking, I think it's our best sort of way of going about things, right? Otherwise, how do you adjudicate the difficulty of all these various conflicting viewpoints of people thinking they all think they know the right way of doing things, right? And they're at odds at various times, at various points, right? So-and-so thinks gambling ought to be permitted, while so-and-so thinks it ought not to, right? And that it's not wise to allow everyone to do it. And that's the problem with paternalism. One of the issues, right, that people like Mill allude to, and one of the worries I think that comes out, at least marginally, in 1984, okay, that, look, you think you're justified in this mass conditioning program, O'Brien, but who are you to say what the perfect life is like and what everyone ought to be steered toward? Okay? I mean, who's to say that your picture of that is the ideal one? I mean, after all, don't we all think we're rational and that we have a pretty good picture of the life that we want to live? So, again, how do you pragmatically or practically uphold that sort of paternalistic outlook? And that's always been kind of an issue that I've looked at in sort of, for what it's worth, kind of been on Mill's side with respect to, and I think Orwell's hinting at a lot of those issues too in 1984. And by the way, so I mentioned that in Animal Farm it comes out even more, these issues with paternalism. But I want to just mention a quote that's at the bottom of page 59, at least in my version of Animal Farm, that's speaks to the sort of mentality of those fostering these paternalistic ideas. So this was Snowball. I'm not going to get into the details. Actually, Squealer, one of the pigs in Animal Farm, like the smarter animals, right? That are sort of manipulating the others at this point in the story. and they're getting all the, I think it was corn, I don't remember what it was, one of the crops. They get to take it all. The pigs are taking it all, and he's trying to justify to the other animals on behalf of all the pigs why this is happening. And it's basically like paternalism. And I mean, this reminded me so much. I heard this yesterday as I was listening to it. Reminded me so much of it that I took note of it for this episode. So he says, speaking to the other animals of the farm, but sometimes you might make the wrong decisions, comrades, and then where should we be? Right? So I can't let you do whatever you want, right? The pigs, we're the smartest animals. We have to steer the ship, if you will, because otherwise you would make dumb decisions. So in your own interest, I have to tell you what you can and can't do. And that includes us taking all the crop for this harvest. Right? So again, this idea of conditioning and conditioning on paternalistic grounds, these are things I've thought a lot about and that are certainly prevalent themes, wrong book, certainly prevalent themes in 1984. All right, so I've mentioned, what the book's about, talked about some of the prominent themes. Now I want to kind of summarize, I guess, some of my general thoughts about 1984. So, I've hopefully conveyed fairly well how much I've thought, intensively about some of the issues and some of the themes that come out in 1984. So obviously it's going to, be a book that I look favorably upon, right? That resonates with me. Having said that, I did think it was interesting. It wasn't quite the masterpiece I had always held in the back of my mind, right? So from whenever I read it, 20 plus years ago, I had always just held it up as being one of the greatest books I'd ever read. And that's actually probably still true. But it wasn't quite as good as I'd always kind of remembered it being. And maybe this is can be the case a lot of times when we go into books that have we have high expectations for. Maybe it's a result of me coming back into it with these extremely high expectations that I was a little let down. But having said that, though, I say a little let down, I mean, it's still very, very good. It's just not the masterpiece that I, remembered it being all those years. I mean, but I do want to stress, though, that it is still extremely good to the point where, again, I don't remember the last time whatever I'm listening to on my runs and my audio, through my MP3 player, where I'll actually take the time to then put them on my computer and then find the spot I was at and listen to it here in the house. Well, I did that with 1984, so that speaks to how much I did get into it and how it is, very gripping at times and compelling and keeps you wanting to keep going. So I don't mean to say that it's not good, because it is absolutely very, very good. It's just not the masterpiece that I remembered it being all these years. And so I'm curious, this will be, at least in terms of audiobooks, this is next, but then this is going to be after this. And I'll be curious to see if it's in fact true that I still kind of view this as being better. So stay tuned for that for future episodes. Okay, I do. Yeah, one last kind of final thought before I get to my book Musings grade that I did want to mention was this ending. So I think again, the second part of the book is, I don't know exactly at what point. It might not be exactly right in the middle, but around the middle, right? He gets caught, and then it's just torture and philosophy, philosophical banter back and forth. Him and O'Brien, this guy he thought he could trust and confided in, and of course, he was a member of Big Brother or was Big Brother essentially, and so they go back and forth, and O'Brien tries to sort of justify what's going on and so on, and Winston just struggles understanding any of it. And I think, and ultimately, so Winston ends up being conditioned to, probably in large part because of the insufferable pain. ends up loving Big Brother, not caring what happens, not questioning anything anymore, and takes a bullet in the hand at the very end. That's how the novel ends. And so, I read a few reviews and so on, and some people don't like the ending, some people do because it's realistic and so on. And here are my thoughts. I think the ending was one of the problems I have, and not necessarily the ending, but like the whole second half of the book. And that's just, it's not because I always need a happy ending. It's that I think the issue is that this is so eerily close to, Winston and his struggles are so eerily close to kind of how I feel intimately at times, that I want some semblance of hope. I don't want a picture of the future where I'm just destined to doom and a bullet in my head, right? I want some vision where at least maybe it's not even super realistic, but some semblance of hope, right? Some reason to keep going, provided some of these things are coming true, right? And what Orwell delivers me is this message of this fatalistic, what does it even matter? Why even try? Because no matter how fervently you question things, it seems like, Winston Smith seemed to question things at the core. He was as rebellious as it comes. And no matter how much you have that in your nature, Orwell seems to be saying, you can be bought, you can be sold, you can be conditioned. And that's not, again, maybe it's just because it doesn't make me feel good, but it is what it is. It doesn't make me feel good. He might be correct, and that might be realistic, but I have to speak to that being one of the ways I felt coming out of the novel. And again, I think that a lot of that is because it struck so close to home that I want to be able to have the hope that somebody that feels and thinks like Winston does, that there is some hope for such an individual, right? And that they're not just going to be destined to the same fate as everyone else that's conditioned by the system. But Orwell gives us no hope, or at least not with this, right? And so, I don't know. I don't. Again, that's just one reason why. One issue I don't think it's a huge issue against Orwell. Again, maybe it's the more realistic conclusion or ending. But I don't know. I think I would have had more of a smile. I don't think I had a smile on my face, right? How do you have a smile on your face at the end of this book? It would have been nice to have a smile on my face at the end of the book, but maybe that wasn't Orwell's intention, right? Maybe it's not the point of his book to make us smile. Maybe it's to make more of us scared. Well, I'm already scared, George, and that's why I would have liked a better ending. Anyway, I've belabored that point, I think. Blah, blah, blah. So, I guess let me just end that point by saying that I don't think Orwell's necessarily right either. At least if his intimation was that all is doomed. I think there are people who have enough conviction that no matter the turmoils, the suffering, the torture that might be inflicted on them, they will not be converted. Maybe that's just how everyone like Winston or myself thinks going into it. Maybe the point is that's what you think, but that's still what I think. I like to think anyway that for certain Winstons out there, there's no degree of torture that'll make them say they love Big Brother. At least that's something I'm clinging to at this point. But again, maybe Orwell's point is that maybe there's not good reason to think that. I need something positive, though. Give me something a little bit more positive, Orwell. He doesn't give us much that's positive. Let's go ahead and transition then to the book musings grade. So ultimately, this offers us a frightening look into the future, a dystopian sort of account of what might transpire. Of course, he wrote it in 1949, projecting what 1984 would look like, which in many ways kind of is what's happening now. So, of course, we're past 1984 at this point, right? 2021, early 2021. But in many ways, I think I would have to argue Orwell's premonitions, his predictions, if you will, his worries, his concerns have, many of them have come to fruition, as people like Snowden have seemingly confirmed. So, I think that if nothing else, kudos to Orwell for doing a good job sort of projecting what the future might look like. It's not maybe sending off the happy vibes I wished it would at times, but nevertheless, definitely a great read, great listen, I guess, this time around for me. I'm going to give it an A. So this will be our second entrant into the Book Musings Hall of Fame. Our first entrant was Harry Brown and his How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World. So our second entrant again is 1984 by George Orwell. So kudos to Mr. Orwell for writing a very good book. Didn't quite reach the top shelf. Again, not quite the masterpiece I had in my mind all these years. I don't know why I had it in my mind like that all these years. But very, 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 very good. Almost top shelf. So close. But so George Orwell, 1984 gets an A. Wanted to end by kind of talking a little bit about what might be on tap. I already mentioned how next audiobook, so stay tuned very, very soon. Probably do a short one on Animal Farm. Love this. I'm really enjoying it. Should be a couple more runs and I'll probably have this finished. It's actually a much shorter novel. What is it? 128 pages. So stay tuned to that for that one, that review, and then or that book musings episode. And then I'll also want to do Aldous Huxley again, read Brave New World. Really looking forward to that. Also wanted to mention, I don't know that I'll actually get around to these next necessarily super soon. I forgot to grab Propaganda by Bernays. I mentioned him before. I'm almost done with that one. I'll probably have an episode on that fairly soon. Again, that's Propaganda. Pretty interesting book he wrote, I think, back in 1929. Couple new purchases here that I just picked up. So just picked this one up off Amazon. I hadn't heard of it anywhere else, but I'm really into Ted Kaczynski and his reflections on technology and how that affects our everyday life. Again, if you've seen some of my other videos, you're probably aware of that. But so looking forward to reading that at some point. And then I came across somewhere that this book was the most highly requested, most coveted book in the prison system, and heard really interesting things about this book. The 48 Laws of Power. Some of you might be familiar with it. I guess it is a national bestseller. But I heard a lot of comparisons to, like I mentioned, I think Machiavelli and The Prince earlier. Sort of some comparisons to that, and so was really my interest is piqued, and so I picked up a copy of this, and it's got an interesting style. So looking forward to digging further into this at some point. But anyway, that's it for now. Hope you enjoyed episode 4 of Book Musings, where I took a look at the classic 1984 by George Orwell. Definitely highly recommend it. It made the Book Musings Hall of Fame after all. Highly recommend it, and I'm enjoying so far Animal Farm. So stay tuned probably for the next episode on that. We'll see. Thank you.